At 2:30 a.m. on April 7, 2008, 45-year-old Kathleen Schroll made a hidden phone call to her mother, panting and struggling to catch her breath. She informed her mother that a man named Pete Queens, the son of an elderly man Kathleen had cared for years, had suddenly entered her home and shot her husband, 64-year-old Carl Schroll. Kathleen expressed to her mother that she was extremely fearful and asked her to call the police immediately, fearing she would be the next victim of Pete's rage. Before her mother could reply, the call was abruptly disconnected. Kathleen's mother tried to call her back several times, but with no success, as Kathleen had stopped answering calls and texts, indicating that the worst might have already happened. This prompted Kathleen's mother to contact the police right away to report what was happening at her daughter's home. Kathleen's mother, in her conversation with the dispatchers, explained that her daughter was in imminent danger, noting that Kathleen was crying and screaming while on the phone. Therefore, the police were obligated to send units immediately to Kathleen's home in Kansas City, Kansas. Just minutes after receiving her call, police patrols began arriving at Kathleen's residence, but it was clear that they were somewhat delayed, as they discovered the body of Kathleen's husband, Carl, who had been shot twice in the chest. Kathleen was found with a gunshot wound to the back of her head, and next to her body, investigators discovered her personal firearm. At that stage, it was unclear whether Kathleen used it in self-defense or if the assailant used it to shoot her and her husband. Naturally, investigators arrested Pete immediately after the victim herself indicated that he was the one who targeted them, especially after they learned that Pete was in a legal battle against Kathleen at the time of the crime, which ultimately led to his conviction. However, years after Pete's conviction, new questions about the crime scene arose, and evidence began to emerge suggesting that authorities rushed to charge Pete. At the time of her death, Kathleen and Carl Schroll had been married for a decade and were considered the perfect couple by everyone who knew them. Their married life was happy, filled with laughter and shared jokes, despite the significant age gap between them, Carl being about 20 years older than Kathleen. When Kathleen was in her 30s, Carl retired from his job while Kathleen continued to work at the local credit union, a job she held for several years. However, with Carl's retirement, Kathleen needed to find a new source of income to compensate for the sudden financial gap the family faced. As a result, Kathleen began looking for an additional evening job and soon found work as a caregiver for a wealthy elderly man in his 80s named Olin Queens. Some media reports indicated that Olin was indeed suffering from dementia at the time. Several people close to Kathleen attested that she had become particularly close to Olin, forming a real emotional bond regardless of the professional relationship. Kathleen treated Olin as if he were her father, caring for him deeply and seeing him with great affection, not solely for financial reasons. When Olin passed away, everyone was surprised to learn that he had made Kathleen the sole beneficiary of his life insurance policy, which was valued at around $42,000. This development did not sit well with Olin's son, Pete, who accused Kathleen of forgery and filed a lawsuit against her. Investigators learned through interrogating Kathleen's friends and some family members that she confided in them that Pete was extremely angry, and importantly, he was not hiding his anger from her. Kathleen told some of her friends that Pete had confronted her in various places, merely casting evil looks in her direction. More significantly, some of Kathleen's relatives confirmed to investigators that Pete confronted her at a small store near her home while she was shopping, and he did not just glare at her. He approached her and warned that she would not spend any more of her father's money. This incident occurred just 2 days before Kathleen and her husband were killed in their home. Kathleen's family members confirmed that she returned home that day, trembling with fear after leaving the store in a hurry without responding to Pete's comments. She expressed to them that she began to fear for her life and suspected that Pete's harassment could escalate to something more severe. It was easy for investigators to believe this account, as Pete was a strong and hefty man weighing around 300 pounds, meaning he could easily instill fear in the heart of that poor and fragile woman. and there was no doubt he could have harmed her and her elderly husband. Returning to the crime scene, investigators noted that Carl had been shot twice in the chest. However, he had a deep wound to his head, and there was nothing to indicate a bullet had entered that area. The initial conclusion from investigators was that Pete had struck Carl on the head with a blunt object before firing twice at his chest, leading to his death. Kathleen's body was found in the living room with a gunshot wound to the back of her head and her registered firearm, .38 caliber pistol, nearby. Forensic reports later confirmed that this gun was indeed the murder weapon used against the couple and that it ended their lives. Strangely, investigators found no signs of forced entry at any of the home's entrances or exits. It was illogical for either of the couple to allow Pete into their home at such a late hour, especially since Kathleen was afraid for her life due to Pete. Moreover, it didn't make sense for Pete to use Kathleen's personal gun to kill the couple. If he had broken into their home intending to harm them, he should have come prepared. Investigators soon started to suspect that what transpired was that Kathleen shot her husband and then turned the gun on herself. They couldn't ignore the fact that Kathleen had accused Pete just moments before her death, along with the ongoing legal battle between Pete and the victim. Consequently, investigators concluded that Pete was the one who shot the couple, ending their lives. He had somehow staged the crime scene to appear that Kathleen was the perpetrator, but he did not realize that Kathleen had called her mother in her final moments to reveal the identity of the shooter, which ultimately foiled his entire plan. Less than 48 hours after discovering the bodies of Kathleen and Carl in their home, authorities secured a court order to arrest Pete and search his residence. He was apprehended while dropping his children off at the school bus stop. Pete was shocked when police arrested him, and when investigators took him to the police station and began questioning him directly about the charges, he vehemently denied any involvement in the crime, claiming he was at home with his family during the time of the murder. During this challenging time, he received much moral support from his family, who testified that he had indeed been at home with them when the crime occurred. However, authorities dismissed this testimony, believing that his family was trying to extricate him from the dilemma he found himself in. As a result, investigators moved forward with legal proceedings and referred Pete for trial after they laid out their version of events, which indicated that Pete somehow managed to break into the couple's home. When Kathleen heard strange noises in her home, she armed herself to defend against an intruder, but Pete managed to force her to drop her weapon after striking her husband on the head with a blunt object. Ultimately, he seized the pistol and shot Carl twice in the chest before ending Kathleen's life with a shot to the back of her head. Pete's trial began in early January 2009. Throughout the proceedings, Pete maintained his innocence, but the case unfolded in an incredibly unusual manner. He was convicted of murdering Kathleen while being acquitted of the charges related to Carl's death. In the end, Pete was sentenced to 50 years in prison without the possibility of parole. But the story did not end there. After a while following the conviction, defense attorney Patty Kalb took over the case and quickly noticed that there were pieces of evidence that had been overlooked by the court. She was able to prove this, ultimately leading to a decision to retry the case just months after the initial trial. Once again, Pete was brought before the court, this time with renewed hope of winning the case, especially after his attorney worked tirelessly to address gaps in the prosecution's case and highlight evidence that had been missed during the first trial. However, Pete's hopes of acquittal quickly faded when he discovered that the prosecution had prepared a key eyewitness who would completely change the course of the trial. This key witness was a fellow inmate who claimed that Pete confessed to him that he had committed the crime, stating that Pete revealed he entered the home through a window that the couple often left open. Based on this inmate's testimony, the jury convicted Pete for the second time, and the verdict was confirmed. Although Pete continued to insist he was innocent and his family remained supportive, the years passed swiftly, and everyone began to forget about Pete, who had now spent over a decade behind bars while his children grew up outside. with some even getting married and having children of their own. He was deprived of experiencing all of this, which led him to despair, believing he would never leave prison. This prompted him to attempt to end his life on several occasions, but the prison medical unit acted quickly each time and was able to save him. In the fall of 2018, a nonprofit organization dedicated to reviewing wrongful conviction cases took on Pete's case after discovering numerous inconsistencies in the inmate's testimony that led to Pete's second conviction. For example, the witness indicated that Pete entered the house through a bedroom window, which was impossible due to Pete's weight, around 300 pounds at the time of the crime. Additionally, the witness claimed that Pete told him he drove a red Jeep to the couple's home and sped away after committing the crime, when in fact, Pete had sold that vehicle more than a year before the crime occurred. More importantly, Pete's defense team discovered overlooked evidence during previous trials. Upon examining the crime scene photos, they noted dark red stains on one of the pillows in the couple's bedroom, which clearly indicated remnants of blood. However, that pillow had not been examined previously because investigators were convinced that Pete committed the crime, and they did not bother to scrutinize the evidence closely. The prosecution team requested the court to withdraw the pillow from the evidence locker and subject it to detailed examination. When the pillow was examined, forensic experts found a .38 caliber bullet inside it, and the blood remnants were confirmed to belong to Kathleen Schroll. Based on this new evidence, Pete's defense team reshaped their narrative to suggest that Kathleen was the one who shot her husband. They argued that Kathleen initially tried to do so quietly by firing at him through the pillow, but the bullet inflicted a deep wound to his head without entering his brain, which led her to shoot him twice in the chest before taking her own life with a shot to the back of her head. The defense team elaborated on several facts to reinforce their perspective, raising questions about why Kathleen chose to call her mother instead of the police. Moreover, the arrangement of the living room, where Kathleen sheltered while speaking with her mother just moments before her death, faced the front door directly. This meant that she could have easily fled the home while Pete was busy shooting her husband, but oddly, she chose to stay and call her mother instead. Based on this new evidence and theories, Pete was granted a third trial. This time, his defense team requested a re-examination of all evidence collected from the crime scene, and it quickly became clear that Kathleen's gun had no trace of Pete's DNA on it. Not only that, but forensic reports proved that the only person who used that weapon the night of the crime was Kathleen herself, as her DNA was found on the firearm. Additionally, traces of gunpowder and small burns were found on her palm, confirming she was the shooter. The forensic report also indicated no physical evidence at the crime scene suggesting that Pete had visited the couple's home the night of the crime. Furthermore, Pete's defense team was able to demonstrate that Kathleen's life was not as ideal as she had portrayed to her family and close friends prior to her death. The middle-aged woman faced criminal charges that could have resulted in imprisonment, as authorities had presented clear evidence against her, indicating that she had committed fraud and stole $3,000 from Olin, Pete's father, transferring that money into her own account shortly before the elderly man passed away. Additionally, Pete himself had managed to establish several counts against her concerning the mistreatment of the elderly, after observing that his father's body was full of bruises and various wounds. Those weren't the only legal troubles Kathleen faced in the days leading up to her death. In addition to the job at the credit union that she had held for several years, some of her former employers testified that she was on the brink of imprisonment due to those charges. However, fate intervened before she could face trial, and she met her demise before any formal charges could be brought against her. Moreover, Pete's fellow inmate was interrogated in light of the new evidence during this trial, and this time he recanted his earlier statements, confessing that he had fabricated the entire case to secure a deal with the prosecution to lessen his own sentence, especially after realizing that the prosecution was keen on finding evidence to convict Pete. The scenario crafted by Pete's defense involved Kathleen feeling desperate at that point in her life, and preferring death over the shame and suffering imprisonment would bring to her husband and children. Additionally, she did not want Carl to witness the dark, malicious side of her personality that she had hidden under her gentle demeanor for all those years. All those factors, along with the psychological pressures Kathleen faced in the days leading up to her death, led her to decide to leave this world alongside her husband definitively. But she wouldn't depart without enacting revenge on Pete, who was the reason authorities scrutinized her finances after he filed a lawsuit against her, accusing her of forgery. Thus, Kathleen devised a sinister plan to implicate Pete in the crime she was about to commit against herself and her husband, certain that no one would suspect a woman would lie in her final moments in this life. This time, Pete's defense managed to persuade the jury of his innocence, and the previous ruling against him was overturned, leading to his release in November 2020. Pete was elated to finally return to his family after spending 13 years behind bars, but he announced that he was ready to forget the past and leave it behind, intending to focus on his future and that of his children. He expressed his desire that in 15 to 20 years, he would look back at his imprisonment as nothing more than a speed bump in the rearview mirror, stating that if one does not dwell on it, they win. He simply wanted to spend the rest of his life pursuing what he has, rather than mourning for what he had lost. Unfortunately, Pete's hopes and dreams were shattered when fate did not give him much time to enjoy his freedom, as he was soon diagnosed with lung cancer after being released and ultimately succumbed to this malignant illness at the age of 64 in February 2021, just 108 days after his release from prison, thereby writing the last chapter of his tragic and heartbreaking story.